This week on To the Contrary. First, a surprising number of women joining jihad. Then, the impact of closing abortion clinics. Behind the headlines, putting women's empowerment on the fast track. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, the new face of extremism. In the wake of the devastating Paris terror attacks, we're learning more about women joining the jihad. The Islamic State has seen a 20% growth in women volunteers. In fact, a new study finds 1 in 7 ISIS recruits is a Western woman. The average age, 21. In the raid where the mastermind of the attacks was killed, one woman detonated her suicide vest and a second was taken into custody. Experts say, generally, women are not frontline fighters, but their influx is a game changer.
Women represent a key component of state building. They represent the longevity of a statehood, of creating the next generation. So there's been a call for women to join, not as combatants, but actually as major players in building this utopian idea of a state that they have.
Ayaan Hirsi Ali was raised Muslim but has renounced the religion. She says extremists present two worldviews to potential recruits.
They present them with a world of good versus evil. And good is Islam. It's pure. It's just. And there are rules for those who want to lead a life of justice and who want to suffer and sacrifice to please Allah. And evil is Western civilization, where all religions and no religion is just fine. It's up to you to decide.
The Institute studies jihadist recruitment of women.
We have an age range from 14 to 45. Some of them have PhDs. Some of them are less educated and more socioeconomically disadvantaged, and others definitely were not. They came from very stable families.
The narrative that these people are marginalized and they feel a sense of alienation, that they're victims of discrimination. Every time we give the marginalization talk, we're empowering the Islamists because we're reinforcing their message.
Sasha Havlicek says the Institute piloted a counter-messaging project to respond to the sophisticated online peer-to-peer recruitment by extremists.
If we want to stop this, we need desperately to be reaching out to girls before they start getting radicalized and recruited. One-to-one engagement between young people expressing extremist sympathies online and a former extremist. We found an extraordinary engagement rate of over 60%, which just gives you a sense of how thirsty these kids are for the conversation.
If we want to stop the next generation from joining that message, we have to start looking at Islamic schools, mosques, Muslim centers, all of these, and not all of them are conveying this message, but most of them are. And we have to look at the message that they are conveying to the youth, who they target, and who funds these. What is their agenda? Once we understand that, we'll be able to engage and communicate with the young people that they target and perhaps persuade them. Ultimately, when you push Sharia on people who don't want it, the first group that suffer are women.
So, Manal Omar, first let me say that the news came out that the woman in Paris who, in the raid on Wednesday, may not have detonated her own suicide vest. But secondly, how, if at all, can the West try to stop these young women, particularly, from joining ISIS?
I think the most important thing is to really see ISIS as a global threat. And the more the West positions them as a global threat and tries to break down what ISIS is trying to say, which is this is the West against Islam, it's really the world against ISIS, because everyone is being targeted. And we've seen China, Russia, the US, but the number one victims are Muslim. And so I think it's important that we take that message and say ISIS is targeting everyone and strip them away from the religious claim.
I think we have to get much more serious about this than we've been, Bonnie. I mean, these are not just one-off attacks anymore. They're getting more serious each time. They're becoming more frequent. And every time they have a success, it makes it much easier to recruit both young men and young women into their ranks. We got to take this on, and it's an effort that's not just U.S., but we certainly have to be in it.
Mm-hmm. It's global, absolutely. In terms of messenger, who's the right messenger here? And I believe very strongly that it's Muslim women, and that we must listen to Muslim women, respect Muslim women, and fund them to lead this work.
I think part of this is about technology, too. You're seeing 90,000 tweets per day coming out of ISIS, sending a message that is counterintuitive to what we believe and what our Western values promote and support. So I think you're seeing the State Department, I think you're seeing groups like Sasha's take an engaged effort to sort of counteract that agenda in a positive way on social media.
I wonder if the part of what we need to be doing is banning the dark network, the dark internet, rather. Most of these communications have been through the dark internet, meaning encrypted. Why can't we go to the companies and shut them down that allow that technology?
I don't think it's an option. I mean, I think that there are always ways, and we're seeing very strong sophistication in terms of technology. I remember when I was very young, before Facebook, before Twitter, before any of the online chats, I was on IRC, Interrelay Chat, which was through informal ways of chatting all across the world. And that was the first time, which was around 1993, that I heard the name Bin Laden. And it took, the world another decade before they heard it. And I've always been surprised at how preventable his growth was.
Yeah. When you were young, did anyone try to recruit you?
Absolutely. I mean, most of the chats were reaching out to Muslim communities and saying, you may think that you're American, but you'll never be welcome there. There's a place for you here. Come back to your real roots. I mean, that was the primary messaging across the chat rooms, which was, as a young person, very curious to see this global community that was beginning to form in cyberspace.
And how did you resist it? Sorry, Genevieve.
I think the resistance was just recognizing, that I am part of the fabric. I've never felt alienated. And I think that's what worries me about this week. This was the first time I walked the streets in D.C. and rode the metro, and I was afraid. I'm more afraid. I've been in Benghazi, Baghdad, and Kabul. I'm more afraid in D.C. in this week after the Paris attacks than I have been in a very long time.
Mm. Yeah, I was just going to say, on the intelligence front, I mean, our agencies were built in the 1950s. Very different world than we live in today when it comes to intelligence gathering. And what we see via social media, we are woefully inadequately set up for this. I think that's probably true of much of Western Europe as well. But the U.S. is behind on this, and that's where a good chunk of this battle is being fought out, war, frankly. Well, so we've got to get on it.
And we're working towards that. I met with a number of Republican leaders this week who are really engaging at the highest levels with the technology industry, trying to build working groups, because no thanks to Edward Snowden, these folks have the ability to be a part of the dark net, and that's really limiting our ability from an intelligence standpoint to take the next level, but also to try to get our message out in a positive way.
But and I want to get back to specifically the young women and the girls who are being recruited, but just momentarily, as I understand it, with the dark net, once it's encrypted, even the companies that make that technology cannot unencrypt it.
That is correct. So we have to start getting creative, and so I think there is outreach going on to try to figure out how these companies can help us and how we can figure out ways to get to that next place.
But we're behind.
Again, we are very much behind.
And if people don't get on it right now, I mean, look, they are ahead of us, and people can say, well, again, these are kind of one-off things. They are connected, and they're not just connected within their part of the world, they're connected now increasingly all over. And I think we've been very slow to realize this and take it as serious as we should.
And they're strategic. They're connected and strategic, and they've been planning a lot of these movements for decades. We're just catching up to that reality, which is, I think, why we're so unprepared.
And again, what's your advice? I mean, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, whom you did an online appearance with that attracted thousands and thousands of viewers, and you're both my sheroes, I must say. What's your advice? I mean, there is obviously a huge anti-Syrian refugee movement going on in the United States, both in the U.S. House, which passed a ban that will be vetoed by President Obama, and there aren't the votes to override. But what should the U.S. message be?
The U.S. message, I would support you completely, is to really take the cue from people in the region, but to do it carefully. Often we find very strong advocates, and they're all there, from Nigeria to Uganda to Yemen to all over the areas we're talking about, Pakistan. You have people who are fighting extremism. We have to support them, but we have to do it very carefully so we don't, what I call, hug them to death, where we delegitimize them and then they don't have moral authority anymore because they're tied too much to the U.S. So that balance is absolutely essential, but we shouldn't be the ones up front. We should be supporting those who are in the heat of the conflict.
Yeah, I mean, the technology piece is very important, obviously, but this message is resonating. And so I think that's something, if we want to really win this long term, we've got to say, you know, what is resonating about this message with young girls? And I think that goes back to my original point of why it's so important to have Muslim women leading this discussion, because that is the most credible messenger for unpacking, you know, why this is so dangerous and horrible and something that no one should do.
Why is there a movement afoot by the U.S. government, by other governments, to recruit women such as yourself to get online, talk to these young girls, and explain to them that they'll be used as prostitutes, that they'll have a new husband every day, which is essentially giving the man a right to rape them and impregnate them?
Yeah. I mean, there hasn't been any movement that I'm aware of in terms of the U.S. government reaching out specifically. I think that there have been campaigns that the State Department and other people have been supporting, but there are a lot of Muslim women who are stepping forward. I mean, I just think about my own experience. In the last 2 years, I've written about religion more than I have in all my 40 years because I recognize that need. This week alone, I got at least 100 emails from young Muslim women who are saying, we're trapped. We're being targeted by our community here in America. I'm getting dirty looks. I feel really angry that I'm being blamed for something, and yet I'm really, furious at seeing that my religion is being used for violence. What do we do? And so there's a thirst for it to the point where they're Googling and finding me. I'm not reaching out. So I think that there's a huge gap that needs to be filled where Muslim women have a platform to push back.
And I have one very important last question I want to ask you. Hirsi Ali, maybe not in the bite that we used, but she did. I'm sorry. One of the people we interviewed said that young Islamic women see wearing even the niqab as a feminist statement because they see it as they control their sexuality, and yet Westerners see Islamic women, even such as yourself, who are covering their heads, as sort of traitors to American. How do you juggle those different cultural influences?
Absolutely. I mean, it's very difficult, especially because I'm very entrenched in women's rights and the feminist movement, and so I'm asked this question all the time, like, you're wearing the very sign of patriarchy. How can you call yourself a women's rights advocate? And it's a very liberating experience to make a choice of what you wear, whether it's too little or too much. I believe in both spectrums completely, and I think the fact that you're challenging women who choose to wear scarves, such as myself, it feeds the ISIS narrative, and it pushes us away from the mainstream, which is where we really are.
All right. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie Urbay or at To The Contrary. From ISIS and women to women's health. Women are inducing their own abortions without medical guidance when abortion clinics nearby close down. That's the finding from a pair of online surveys by the University of Texas. Somewhere between 100,000 and almost 250,000 Texas women between the ages of 18 and 49 have tried to end their pregnancies by themselves, and not just by using hormonal-induced abortions. Other reported methods include herbs or homeopathic remedies, getting hit or punched in the abdomen, or using alcohol or illicit drugs. This finding comes as the Supreme Court announced it will hear Whole Woman's Health v. Cole. The case will decide the constitutionality of a Texas law requiring stricter building codes in abortion clinics. Most Texas clinics weren't built to meet the codes designed for outpatient surgery centers. Many closed down as a result. So do we know if any of these women have died trying to give themselves abortion? Because you can get infected, and if you don't go for medical care, which they won't, most of them won't, they can die.
That's a profound question, Bonnie, and I think, we won't really know the answer to that, partially because not only is the pro-life movement attempting to shut down all of the clinics, but then they're also attempting, on the other side, to criminalize and incarcerate women who attempt to self-induce. There's a woman named Purvi Patel in Indiana who's currently serving a 20-year prison sentence after she was convicted of ordering misoprostol over the internet and self-inducing a miscarriage. There's a woman in Georgia, Kenlecia Jones, who was handcuffed and taken to jail. And so the fact is, how do we know? It's not even safe at this point for women who do self-induce or who do have home abortions to go to the medical providers and get support afterward if they do experience complications. So it's really a tragedy. This Texas law has nothing to do with health and safety. It's wonderful that the Supreme Court is taking it on. It needs to be overturned.
Well, I would say the whole reason they were having this debate and the reason this law was passed is because a lot of women were dying at a place like Gosnell, a doctor who was running this abortion clinic.
But he was in Philadelphia.
Yeah, he was. Well, he was. But I'm just saying you're giving.
Texas?
Well, yeah, but I'm just saying that you're giving examples of Indiana and other places where women try to self-induce and or get in trouble. This is a scenario where you had a abortionist running a clinic that was filthy dirty, and women were dying there. And usually people on even the pro-choice side agree with that. So Texas said that can be happening in other places. They're one of several states that said, we think if you're going to have an abortion in a clinic, they ought to meet certain medical standards, just like you would at other ambulatory areas. But let me finish on this study.
That's absurd. That's over.
But let me finish on this.
Over $1 million in renovations. The clinics have closed. There were over 40 clinics in Texas at the time that this law was passed. Right now,
did any women ever die or get really sick from abortions in those clinics?
That is, I have not heard of a single one. That actually, you're more likely to experience complications getting routine dental procedures than having an abortion. So this is absolutely.
Well, I know you were saying abortion's not a serious procedure.
And if we want to talk about Texas specifically and the situation that women in Texas are facing, because there are border checkpoints all over the state, there are women who it's literally not safe for them to go seek.
Bonnie, I got to just tell you but let me just talk about the numbers here. Okay, first of all, this is an online survey of 800 people in a state of 30 million, and the methodology.
Your
you
have to look
state.
at
my home state. The methodology or that you would look at here, looking at polls, it's somewhat questionable. And because let's look at the real data, which is you've had fewer abortions since this was passed, and secondly, you've also had the number of pregnancies go down. The birth rate's fallen in Texas, which would tell you unintended pregnancies haven't gone up. And the question in the survey said, have you ever tried to induce yourself in an abortion? It didn't say since 2013 when the law was passed. So the idea that these are real numbers for Texas, I just don't think are legit. And we ought to have legit numbers if we're going to have a legitimate discussion.
I have to say this conversation really depresses me. It scares me in the sense that I spend a lot of time working for reproductive rights and women having access to clean abortion areas across the world, and to turn around and to think that we're losing it in the U.S. and to see the statistics coming out of this survey is really sad and depressing, because it's important that we're able to role model what we're trying to do overseas.
I'm just curious, and I'll get to you, Jennifer, in a second. I'm just curious, we talked in a TTC Extra about the fact that women are falling behind economically in the United States. We used to be #1. We're now down to 28 in the World Economic Forum's survey that was released this week. Does that have anything to do with this fight against reproductive rights that the religious right is waging in America?
Absolutely, Bonnie. That is the core issue that we're fighting here. Are women equal? Should women have dignity? Should we be considered on an equal footing and have justice in society? And I'm so glad that you linked this with economics, security for women, because that's truly what we're talking about. When women are not able to decide when and whether to have children, they simply cannot succeed in their lives. This is something, legal abortion, accessible abortion is something to be proud of. It's a public health advance. It's prevented untold deaths. So it's shameful to close clinics down. Frankly, it's immoral.
Just question, is this a winning issue for Republicans, do you think? And especially with millennials who are used to the freedom of deciding whether or not to access women's health services?
I think the Planned Parenthood videos and the Planned Parenthood debacle really emphasize sort of the need and the importance for higher quality women's health, not related to abortions, but necessarily related to the fact that women need better access to good quality health care, whether that be birth control or contraception. Genevieve makes a great point about the number of abortions having gone down in Texas, and I think that's a positive thing from the pro-life movement. And from the left movement, I think what I would point out is that at the end of the day, is it an undue burden not only to have standards in place for these abortion clinics, but more importantly to make sure that these women have access to a doctor that has admitting privileges and privileges at a hospital nearby. That's the other piece of this puzzle that we haven't talked about. This is still about women's health care, and so you can talk about the burden however you want to perceive it, but at the end of the day, the burden isn't about just making sure these clinics are safe.
This is absurd. Here in Virginia, which also had a clinic shutdown law that I've been working on for years, there's a woman, a patient that I recently worked with, who came up to D.C. She was getting frustrated at the amount of time it was taking to raise the money, and she was starting to wonder aloud what she could do to force it at home. That is not health and safety.
All right, behind the headlines, putting women's equality on the fast track. That's the objective of a new initiative and book co-authored by the first U.S. ambassador for global women's issues, Melanne Verveer.
This is a moment unlike perhaps other moments in that great journey of women to equality around the world and at home. The moment comes because we do have so many women, increasing numbers in positions of responsibility, because we have a strong case, because we've got technology and means to better connect. But it's up to us to seize this moment.
Ambassador Melanne Verveer has been advocating for women for more than 2 decades. She now runs Georgetown University's Institute for Women, Peace and Security. She served as ambassador for global women's issues in the Clinton State Department and co-founded the international rights group Vital Voices. Verveer says today there's proof positive, empirical data that confirm investing in women and girls not only transforms their lives, but strengthens communities. And that makes the case for equality.
Between 12 trillion and 28 trillion is lost to the economies of the world and what that represents for better lives for people because we're not fully closing that gap, tapping the potential of women. We've got to do better there. We have to do better. We've got just enormous numbers of women with talent coming into the workplace today. They rise to a certain level and seem to be up against, call it a glass ceiling, a sticky floor, or what a good friend of mine says is a thick layer of men.
Ambassador Verveer co-authored Fast Forward with Kim Azzarelli, a women's rights advocate from the corporate world. It's designed to nudge or perhaps push the equality process ahead. The book contains inspiring stories of women using their power to make a difference.
I often think about women in a place like India. Several years ago, when I was there, they had passed a quota bill for women at the lowest level of governance, these village councils. And I was with a group of people who said, this won't make any difference. The men will still tell their wives what to do, and it's not really going to change anything. Well, today it's been called the silent revolution in democracy in India because there are over 1 million women on these village councils. The studies show that they are making a huge difference in the way that they are using public resources, that they are making decisions. They're investing in sanitation. They're investing in education. They're investing in the things that the community needs to be able to prosper.
The stories are meant to encourage women to work together with other women and men to achieve equality.
Partnerships for any of us are important. You know, none of us has all the competencies or the resources or whatever it takes to solve a problem, which is why when we say, know your power, find your purpose, and connect with others, that connect with others is vital.
Verveer says this book is about taking action, so it includes a how-to toolkit.
If I have been asked a question anywhere in the world after talking about these issues, it's what can I do? I think there is a hunger to be part of making a difference and finding solutions. But often we discount what any of us can do. Obviously, people at the top have enormous power on a scalable level to bring about change. But we shouldn't discount the power in the middle. We shouldn't discount the power at the base. We shouldn't discount the power that each of us has. And the toolkit is meant for any person to be able to look at herself or himself, but particularly herself, and assess what is my power? What keeps me from exercising it? How do I find my purpose? What makes me passionate? Where can I really have impact?
They've also created an online community called Seneca Women, named after the first women's rights convention held in Seneca Falls, New York in 1848.
And we hope that we just won't read the book. We will internalize it. We will link up with others. We want to provide a resource online, a community also offline, where women can come together, learn where can I volunteer, what can I participate in that I'm not participating in, how can I get my company involved. But we're all part of it. And our goal is that we really seize this moment and be all that we can be and forward progress for women and girls and do it fast. And that's why we say fast forward.
Do you agree with her methods?
Absolutely. I'm part of a group called Running Start, and I think a big part of this is about finding a way to get young women involved in the political process, empowering them and providing them with role models and the skills to succeed. And the more women that we have, not only in a political spectrum, the more likely we are to have women's issues a top priority in our Congress.
You agree, Manal?
Absolutely. I think it's important for the global community to understand it's not nice to support women. It's absolutely necessary, and we are where we are today because of our lack of support of women.
Yeah, and I think the toolkit's a great idea because people often go, oh, yeah, I buy into that, but what do I do about it? And I think the way she laid it out was a really good tool.
Women leaders rock, and anything less than full parity in all aspects of life is just a sick, sexist joke.
And tell me more about that.
Well, sure. I mean, we need accountability. It's not just the elevating women and supporting us and taking our power, but we also need accountability on the flip side, that we need to see women occupying 50% leadership everywhere.
And should that be part of the Republican agenda?
No, I think that's not. I don't think quotas are going to be a part of the Republican agenda anytime soon. But I think in the short term, I think we can still find ways to incentivize and encourage businesses to support better parity in the workplace.
Terrific. Thank you. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter. Visit our website, pbs.org/tothecontrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.